And I would like to call our next speaker to join me on the stage. So in the modern football, data is everywhere, but knowing which information truly impacts performance is what separates insight from noise. Our next speaker works at the intersection of elite football operations, analytics, performance strategy, helping clubs understand what really drives success on the pitch. Please welcome to the stage Robert Rogers. The stage is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for all the wonderful presentations so far. So as you may know, I work for a company called Impact. I may have spoken to some of you all before. We're a part of Catapult. Catapult, you know, I guess they're the industry leaders from a GPS perspective. Impact, I guess, is slightly different. As was mentioned there within the interlude, we are a company who kind of sits in the intersection of technology with the industry, but our background actually comes from being on the pitch. We were founded by two former players, Stefan Hegler and Stefan Reinhardt and Jens Hegler. They both played together in the Bundesliga for Bayer Leverkusen, amongst some other clubs. And they both didn't like the data that was being used to assess them. We've spoken a lot already about data today, and I guess data has been around for a long time in football, as we learned from the English past. From our perspective, the type of data that you use is quite important. And the data that was being used with Stefan and Jens didn't really speak to them as footballers. They didn't feel like it really truly reflected their game. Since then, we've founded a company. That was around about the 2014 time. We are based in Cologne. There's one of our offices there in Cologne. But probably the most important thing about our company, we found out very early on to be able to collect different data to what was available from the typical providers. We had to do that internally. We started off working with the Sports University of Cologne, but very quickly realized that in order to collect the number of leagues that we needed to collect, in order to satisfy the clubs that we work with, we needed to move things over into somewhere we could scale at. So actually over here, if that's the clicker, there are some of the people that we have collecting our data. We have over 500 people based in the Philippines who work on our data collection. It takes around about 9 to 10 hours per game to collect one match. It's really relevant because you'll see a lot of companies claiming that they can collect data at this moment in time. They'll generally use AI technology. I'd really encourage you to just check the data compared to video and see whether that's accurate, because very often we find that as much as it's quicker and it's probably cheaper, it's not quite as accurate as you would hope it would be. But that was the story. We wanted to collect more contextual data within football. And from there, I suppose we've grown. We work with around about 250 clubs and associations around the world. Anybody who's here from Germany will probably have heard of us. We work with 17 of 18 Bundesliga clubs. We help them in recruitment. We help them with analysis of their own games. But from a worldwide perspective, I guess, we've moved further across now from a market perspective, and I guess we've started to work with clubs in Serbia as well. As you've probably heard, I'm English, so I'm not part of the German contingent, but we do work with a number of Premier League clubs as well, and that tends to be where I tend to deal with the clubs. This, I think, is really relevant. So this is one of the things that we kind of noticed about the data that was being used in the sport. What we can see here is a typical NBA court. I know basketball's quite big here as well. A lot of the data that's used in football, you think about possession, you think about entries into the final third, have been ported across from American sports. It really does make you wonder why we continue to use them in football, because, of course, you're going to have a lot of changes of possession, a lot of entries into the final third, or into the paint, as you would call it, within basketball, because the court is so small. I always find it so interesting to see that fits inside of a normal penalty box. The data that's generally used to measure then shots and expected goals that comes from this type of thing tends to not be too specific to football. There is much more essentially in these parts of the pitch, because there's such a distance between getting from one end to another compared to in basketball. The shots in our game are much lower. We need football-specific data to be able to measure it, because, of course, there are many more things than just shots. And that's why we wanted to make, essentially, the first football-specific data set. It sounds stupid, but because generally the American sporting landscape was first to using data, data was developed for hockey, for basketball, for baseball, etc. And we've essentially copied that within our sport. Football is obviously really complex, and therefore we think it's important to measure things that really make sense from a footballing perspective. For example, if anyone's heard of packing, I guess that's what Stefan and Jens came up with around about 10, 15 years ago now. That is generally the concept of taking players out of the game. And that was basically the first thing that we did, and it still is very much the reason why people come back to us as a data provider today. We're able to give that contextual data in terms of how many times have you taken players out of the game, how many of them do you take out of the game, and in what variety do you do that with. Now, I could bore you in terms of how we collect the data here, but instead, I think I'd rather show you a couple of use cases in which we've helped clubs. Possibly the most important thing when collecting our data is to look at what actually matters. The title of the presentation here is Measuring What Actually Wins Games, and that's been really relevant in looking at how we collect data. This is some of the data that we've seen generally ported across from those American sports, and what we've done here is we've looked at the correlation to winning. We've taken the times in which a team has more possession, and we've looked at how often they've gone on to win the game. If you remove draws away from the equation, where you only have games that have winners and losers, only 51% of games won by the team who have most possession of the ball. It's probably not a surprise to anybody here. We can all think of football teams that don't need possession to control the game and to win it. But this was a really big surprise when Stefan and Jens learned that, because as youth players coming through at Bayer Leverkusen, it had been drilled into them from an early age: keep possession of the ball, win your duels, cover the most distance. That'll win your matches. Unfortunately, data suggests that that's not really the case. So we believe we need to collect more specific data. Expected goals has probably become the most well-known advanced data point since back when Stefan and Jens were playing. Everybody's probably heard of it. It's shown everywhere nowadays. Of course, we collect this information as well. We're a little bit frustrated, however, with how our industry has sold it as like the secret to football. There's around about 24 to 25 shots per game in all the matches we've collected. We've done well over 1 million matches now. The problem is we don't know how you get to those shot-taking actions. If you only look at expected goals, it shows you a very small portion of the game. Of course, it's very important, has a relatively high correlation, but in work that we do with clubs, with agencies, wherever else it might be, you want to look at how you get to that shot-taking action. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of things that lead to that, and only going into detail on the shot really leads you in the dark about what actually happens across the rest of the game. So that's the concept of packing. Packing essentially goes into the same level of detail as expected goals on each individual action, whether that's a pass through the lines, whether that's winning the ball back in certain areas. And the proof of concept that we have is, of course, the correlation to winning when a team performs best in packing data is essentially the highest that we can find. 8 out of 10 games won by the team who has the highest scores in our data, and therefore we know that what we're measuring not only makes sense from a footballing context perspective, but it also leads to winning matches. Now, we do all of the other data as well. Don't get me wrong, the stuff that you probably get from other providers, I won't mention them. We do in terms of possession, total touches, pass completion, all this type of stuff. But I wanted to show a couple of use cases in which people use our advanced data, the data that's really, really useful, and some of our solutions, essentially, within the club. First one being a case study. We won't mention any names here, but a club that we work with in Germany, I guess will probably become quite clear in a moment, had a sporting director who fell in love with a player. I'm sure you've all probably had this situation before. They went to watch them in a live match and they thought, well, he's great, I wouldn't mind signing him. Pushed the scouting department to really look at him, and in his own opinion, he'd already made the decision that they were going to sign this player. Unfortunately, the data suggests, and to be fair, most of the scouts suggested, that that was the wrong player. That this was an anomaly, that performance wouldn't be consistent, and therefore probably wouldn't be the best thing to sign him for the long term. So we're going to show how we can use contextual data to then communicate and convince somebody who's maybe had a bias in the decision making to look the other way and think of it from a non-biased perspective. And the player was Nico Schulz. He was, I guess, quite a promising player at Hoffenheim at the time. Anybody who remembers him, he was a very interesting left back. But was he able to transform his performances from there over into Borussia Dortmund? Well, anybody who knows the story will probably agree not. I don't think it was the best of transfers. Our impact score, this is the thing that correlates to winning, found him to be an average Bundesliga left back, essentially, at the time. The problem is, when we compare the opinion, we asked the sporting director, which game did you watch of Schulz? And he watched the game against Hertha Berlin. The game against Hertha Berlin was his best in the season. Based on our data, he was the best Bundesliga left back if you only watched that one game. Unfortunately, however, that was not consistent. This is a chart that we have in our platform that shows essentially the output of the player for each individual game. He'd obviously had some very good games, including that being his best one, but he'd also had some not so good games. And we wanted to make sure that the sporting director had a representative picture of the player. So he wasn't expecting him to do that week in, week out, and thinking he was signing the next Roberto Carlos. So a feature that we built within our platform takes the data that we have and finds the 3 most representative games you can possibly watch as a scout. It's a way of using data to inform people to watch the right games and use the time that they have as efficiently as possible. So when we do that, we have a more recent example here with Jeremy Frimpong. Instead of watching 3 random matches, it will essentially choose the 3 matches that, I guess, match best to the player's overall performance. I suppose this visualization is supposed to show the algorithm going through each individual game and trying to find which one matches Jeremy Frimpong as best as possible. You can see it here. This is some of the data that we have. It looks at the player's abilities in terms of deep runs, obviously being really, really good in these 3 matches against Köln, Stuttgart, and Gladbach. His ability to get to the byline and cut the ball back, also pretty strong in interceptions, front-footed. That is his overall radar for the entire season. So watching that 3-game highlight reel obviously allows you to see the player's overall performance picture. And now that we've added video to what we're able to provide, you don't just get the data and suggestions of which game to watch, we're also able to then provide that to you from a video scouting perspective. So that's one way in which the data can make you a little bit quicker and a little bit smarter as a club to watch a representative video. Case study number 2, and I'm sure this is one that you've all found. We get it week in, week out, especially at this moment in the season. We get told we want to sign a player like Jeremy Doku. Wouldn't that be great if everybody was able to sign a player so talented as him? These are some of the characteristics we kind of found about Doku when we looked at his data. But of course, you might get that from whoever's running Manchester City nowadays to find a replacement for him, or you might get it if you're a Serbian league club or a 3rd division club in Germany. You want to find a player at your level who can perform in this way. And therefore, you need to have specific contextual data to understand exactly what he's doing and trying to match that based on the transfers that you can make. So how can we do that? Well, with our data, we add the context by, instead of looking at, for example, where things happen on the pitch, of course that's important, X and Y coordinates, I'm sure you've all seen a heat map, you've all found touches in the final third from time to time. That's typically what a data provider would do. We provide it as well. Of course, it's an important thing to know how often the player has got the ball in the final third or in the opposition box. But we've developed a technique that goes beyond this. This here is an image that our data science team has pulled out of the touches that Jeremy Doku had for Manchester City last season, based on X and Y coordinates. I don't really think it gives you too much context. You can quite clearly see he's probably getting the ball on the edge of the pitch here and probably dribbling down, getting to the byline. But what does that really mean? Manchester City play a very specific style of play. Jeremy Doku has a very specific style of play. And therefore, in order to really look at that, we have added this extra context with pack-in zones. Pack-in zones, it's a brainchild of Stefan, our founder. This is something that came from his own playing experiences at Bayer Leverkusen. Essentially, we've split the pitch up based on the opposition here. If you imagine we're playing against a team in white, and the opposition are playing a 4-2-3-1, we're kicking from bottom to top. Our team are going to operate in certain areas based on where they're stood. So instead of looking at this based on the pitch markings and looking at the halfway line or the opposition box, if the opposition moves up or down the pitch, these zones will move with it, because generally formations are fluid. Therefore, if we knock the ball out here to our right back and the opposition moves over, some of them quicker, some of them slower, the zones will move with it. It's a completely dynamic system, and it allows us to look at things in a far more contextual footballing way, as opposed to just X and Y coordinates. What that produces, if you look at this video clip, is very different information. When we're analysing here a clip of Toni Kroos, we can see, generally, data would tell you it's a touch in his own box. Absolutely true, we wouldn't argue with that, we tell you that as well. But of course, there has to be some sort of reason behind that, something that goes deeper. Well, we use the opposition to understand it. The pack-in zones are based on the formation, and in this scenario, Girona, the opposition, are playing a 4-4-2. Their 2 strikers are here, their midfield line is here. He's beyond the midfield line, but not beyond the strikers. So he's in an area that we would expect him to be in. That's the defensive midfield zone within the pack-in zone logic. That's very different than knowing he's just in the opposition, his own penalty box. Now, that's the defensive midfield zone in the same way as this one is here. we can see Kroos receive it there beyond the opposition strikers, but not beyond the opposition midfield. If we go back, I suppose probably be a little bit easier to see. This area here, the strikers are here, the midfield line is there. But it's a completely different area of the pitch and a completely different context because the opposition is sitting deep in a low block, asking Real Madrid to break them down. Of course, in this scenario, he has to operate in areas higher up on the pitch. If you look at the X and Y coordinates, I promise you, if you logged into your current data provider and you looked at a heat map, you would think, oh, Toni Kroos was the number 10 for Real Madrid in this game. Obviously, it's not the case. He's had to operate further forward because of how the opposition are operating. And therefore, if we go back to the Jeremy Doku example and think about how we can use this data in real life, here's a couple of, well, left wingers, should we say, based on how most people would describe them, last season. These are the touches based on X and Y coordinates. I can't really tell the difference. Luis Diaz, Jeremy Doku, Kenan Yildiz, maybe looks a little bit more like he comes inside, but there's very little difference. And if you present that to a sporting director, I'm not really sure what they'd probably tell you. I think they'd probably throw the laptop at you. This doesn't really give you too much context, whereas if you split that up based on the packing zones, and we look at it based on where the opposition has stood, you get a completely different picture. The touches are the same, the opposition is different. Luis Diaz, I think more than anybody in Europe, got into this zone, which is essentially directly behind the opposition right back. And he did that 2 times per game, receiving the ball. Testimony to him and his ability to run in behind. But if you're looking for a deep running winger, you could probably use this data to try and find somebody similar to Luis Diaz. On the right-hand side, Kenan Yildiz, he probably received it on the left-hand side quite often, but he also came in between the lines to receive. Anybody who's watched Juventus or Turkey can quite clearly see he kind of operates in those half spaces and as a 10 quite often. Jeremy Doku is most interesting. He doesn't run in behind. Obviously at Manchester City that's difficult, but his own style of play means that he gets on the ball in this area here between the right back and the right winger most often, or even 22 times per game he gets on the ball where you'd expect a left back to be. It's obviously something to do with a specific style, but then he'll dribble, he'll cross, he'll do his thing from there. So to bring it back to that initial question, how can we find a player, instead of looking for them based on the position and saying we want to sign a left winger like Jeremy Doku, we're going to say let's try and find a profile like Jeremy Doku. We use that data to profile him as a classic left winger, somebody who receives in those areas and beats people from the left midfield backing zone and left back packing zone. These are the things that actually go into that profile. There's a couple more things as well. But when we use that to actually profile for players in certain leagues, I've chosen Eastern Europe here within our scouting platform. I found an interesting name come out, and I guess it's already one that's been taken, so unfortunately I don't think you can do anything with him at the moment. Suleiman Sani, incredible player if you get a chance to watch him, I'm sure some of you have. He's already moved to Red Bull Leipzig. He matched the profile very, very well. A 95% match, playing in a way very, very similar to what Jeremy Doku basically does from an output perspective. And therefore, instead of saying we want to sign a good left winger, we're able to sign a left winger that actually fits what we want as a club. And I think that's something that can really help from a data perspective. And just for the sake of consistency, there's his packing zones, scarily similar to Doku. He doesn't quite get on the ball as often in this left-back zone, but certainly receives here and tries to beat his man from that position. He does obviously have the pace to run in behind, but he certainly didn't do that as often at Trentium. And then finally, the ability to play at a certain level. I've gone back to maybe a slightly earlier time here in 2020-21. There are a couple of more recent examples, but I didn't want to criticise any more recent transfers in case anybody here was a part of them. Apologies if anybody's here from VV Venlo. We have a player called Georgios Giamakis. Now, he's had a few clubs over the years, but he certainly had a bit of a purple patch at Venlo. He was the Eredivisie top scorer in that season. Venlo, however, got relegated. And he's quite an interesting case study because this is just looking at his goals scored in the season. He was by far and away the highest goal scorer in the league. There he is with a top scorer trophy in the Eredivisie. Usually that would mean a move to the Bundesliga, a move to the Premier League, 30 million or so. However, if we use data to go a little bit deeper, we can see he was, based on our data, probably the best striker, one of the best strikers in the Eredivisie. That's the thing that correlates to winning, 96%. But do we really want to sign him if we're a Premier League club? Well, we don't. And the reason for that, I guess, is quite simple. We use a model that looks at the standard of every team in the world. That's really important here to add the context to know whether the player is actually performing at a level that we want him to perform at. If you take, for example, here, we've got the Serbian Superliga. Obviously, there are some clubs in here. These blue dots are the other clubs. And essentially what I'm using here is a visualization to show that as the lines go across each of them, we are comparing the standard of each team when they play against each other based on their results. And if we do that across every league that we have in our database, we're able to rank each team against each other. When they then play against each other in European competition, we're able to then rank the standard of each league. And that allows us to benchmark where the Serbian league would be in comparison to the French league, or the Eredivisie in comparison to the Premier League, for example. And I'm sure it won't surprise you to know that when using that model, we can see that, at least in that season, the Eredivisie, there were only 3 teams at a Premier League level. Scoring a goal against ADO Den Haag was the equivalent of scoring a goal against a 3rd division club in England. So it really wasn't that relative to if we're a Premier League club looking to recruit him. And based on that model, if we only look at games against those Premier League standard teams, Giakoumakis didn't do particularly well, should we say. He, I think, scored 1 goal, was ranked amongst the worst. And I always find this really interesting. You could draw a line here, basically to say his performances just got worse the better the opposition got. He was a flat-track bully against your Den Haags and your Waalwijks. I think he scored 4 goals in this game. That's brilliant. Obviously, he wouldn't be playing against that standard of player in the Premier League. So his level was probably somewhere around here. League One Championship in England, and I think he probably found his level based on that. This is a very quick way to save yourself probably a few £1 million or euros and making the wrong transfer. So just for clarity, we ranked him in the 4th percentile, so I think he was better than only 3 other strikers in the Eredivisie based on those games. There are some use cases in which that can work. I was quite like Marcos Senesi, moved at a very similar time. We thought he was very good in the Eredivisie, and he performed at a really strong level. But if you took all of his games against Premier League opposition, he was actually pretty strong. And it made sense that Bournemouth signed him because he was able to maintain a certain performance level, at least against those top-level clubs, your Ajaxes, your AZ Alkmaars, etc. And did that way up, well, just for posterity, we can see in his first Premier League season when he moved to Bournemouth, he performed at a very similar level, 63rd percentile. He was one of the better centre-backs in the Premier League. And actually, when he found his feet in the following season, he was actually one of the best centre-backs in the Premier League. He was able to transition really well. So this allows us to be able to look at him, I guess, based on a more rounded picture. And we knew that he was able to transfer into a higher level. That is it from us. Hopefully those case studies have shown you a little bit of how the data can be used. We do have a session on after lunch at 2:30 in the press room, which is downstairs. We'll be happy to take everybody through the platforms if they want and go through any questions. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great, and hopefully it was insightful.
Do we have any questions from the audience for Robert Rogers? Yes, we do. All right.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask, I think the packing zones are really interesting and something I haven't seen a lot in other data providers, and it simplifies a lot the recruitment process. I wanted to ask, those packing zones take only on-ball actions or also off-ball actions? For example, how do you adapt it to defenders in order to see if they play a high defensive line or a lower defensive line?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to be clear, we only collect event level data. So it's only when the player touches the ball. Yeah. But we are able to collect when the player touches the ball, where the opposition's defensive line are. So that's how we're able to tell if an opposition are sitting with a really high line and on the halfway line, the area in behind will be the exact same as if you're playing against a team sitting on the edge of the box and you're able to get in behind. One thing I would say is that the clear advantage to this is if you were to have tracking data, you could produce that, I guess, at scale, and you'll be able to look at every single time a player makes a run into that area, regardless of whether they receive it or not. Unfortunately, tracking data, the AI technology that tends to create that, is still somewhat inaccurate. If you're looking at that from a scouting perspective across, we do about 200 leagues with our event level data, it's pretty much impossible to be able to produce it. It's really the key to our data set is that it's the same for a Premier League match as it would be for a Bundesliga under-17 match, for example. And therefore, it's a kind of a juxtaposition of the data industry at the moment. We're able to provide it really well for event-level data. Tracking data will come. What I would say is that most clubs, if you're working for a club, will have some sort of agreement within the league that provides them in-house tracking. It doesn't rely on the AI technology that collects things from broadcast footage. They have cameras in the stadiums. That tends to be really, really accurate. And there are clubs that use our data, but also model the packing zones based on the data that they receive officially from the league. That's really, really useful from a team analysis perspective, but of course, it still leaves a lot to be decided from a recruitment perspective. Thanks.
Do we have any more questions for our speaker? Yes, we do. All right.
Thank you very much. 2 questions maybe on the topic of the 2 players that you presented from the Eredivisie. First, how independent is the packing value then from the rest of the team? Because playing for a team like Venlo then that did not perform very well in that season, I can imagine they did not have a striker for them would not have a lot of actions against the top clubs, Ajax Amsterdam, Feyenoord Rotterdam, etc. So how independent would that Greek player be from the rest of the team, or is that somehow falsified then by the performance of the team? And on top of that, this estimation of which clubs are performing on which clubs are good enough for Premier League level and how he performed against them. Taking the agent's perspective, could you do this as an agent yourself with the system, or do you need to reach out to you to create such a report?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So maybe first of all, to cover we would probably call it data standardization as a topic. It's a super tricky topic in general, and any data company that tells you that they've solved it is lying. We haven't solved it. It's a very, very difficult process, and there's no right or wrong answer. We tend to deal with it better because of the packing approach. It's not just breaking lines and being able to play the ball in between the lines that we measure. If you win the ball back, you get credit for it. If you're out of possession very often and you're able to win the ball back and then take players out of the game in that variety, you're also getting credit. And that adds up to the overall score. In fact, there is quite a lot of evidence to say that winning the ball back in high areas is actually more valuable than threading a ball between the lines. It's not as simple as that, but therefore players from lower clubs still get credit from this, and that's why we tend to see there are players from the likes of Venlo who are able to perform particularly well in these scenarios. What I would say, if Giakoumakis was maybe more of a pressing striker, somebody who puts himself about a bit and probably able to perform better out of possession, he would have done better against your PSVs, Ajaxes, etc., etc. Second question about the standard of the leagues, without going into the entire detail of it, because I'm certainly the wrong person from the company to do it. It's a very complex data science model. It takes the closing line of the betting market. It has nothing to do with our data. Our data, as much as I'll tell you here, it's brilliant from a contextual standpoint. Nothing compares to the predictive quality of the betting market. The people that own Brentford and Brighton, they're ahead of the game. The betting market knows things, obviously, that we don't, and the odds essentially change before the start of the match because they know that there's a problem in the club, somebody's not playing, etc., etc. These closing lines we take, and essentially we model the likelihood of the game being won by a team, and then we assign ranking points based on that. Similar to golf or tennis as a ranking system, if a team in first place then gets beat by the team in 10th place, they get more ranking points. It's all available within the platform, so you can do this. And in the platform, I think probably from an agent's perspective, we don't work with a lot of agencies, but the ones that actually do it really well, they will say, I have a player, I can then pick whether he would be able to perform at Extraklasse level or Bundesliga level or whatever else it might be. And it will literally show you the games that he's played in his career against the teams at that level. And it's a really nice way of being able to say, look, he's able to do it at a higher level. Obviously, sometimes it might be the other way and you can't really change the data, but it's pretty strong evidence that they're able to perform at a certain level of a club that you're putting a player to. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So it's time to refresh, but first of all, I would like to give one more round of applause for our speaker, Robert Rogers.